Okay, I would really like to welcome everyone to the first Civil and Environmental Engineering Department's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Seminar Series, which is co-sponsored by the Pelham Scholars Program. Before we get started, I would like to acknowledge that the University of Michigan began with land ceded by the Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi peoples in 1817. And since the focus of this talk today is on education, it's important to recognize that the land ceded and the treaty that formed that was based on the understanding that Native Americans would be educated at the University of Michigan, and that did not happen for 130 years, and that in fact, the Native American student population makes up about 1% of University of Michigan students today, while Native Americans make up about 3% of the state of Michigan. So it's important for us to remain mindful of the broken treaty as we listen to this talk today. Our invited speaker is Professor Devlin Montfort, and it's absolutely our pleasure to welcome him and have him kick off this seminar series. Professor Montfort is an associate professor of chemical, biological, and environmental engineering at Oregon State University. He obtained his BS, MS, and PhD in civil engineering at Washington State University. Professor Montfort began his academic career studying student understanding of engineering concepts, specifically related to the mechanics of materials, using clinical interviews. His research evolved to include not just the students' thinking, but the students thinking about their own thinking. This led to the exploration of personal epistemologies of students, faculty, and engineers. And in collaboration with colleagues at OSU, he is now linking his research on thinking to issues of social justice and inclusion with an emphasis on classroom and pedagogical reform. So thank you so much, Professor Montfort, for being here. Before I turn it over to you, I just want to remind our attendees that you can enable and disable the live transcript option that's available. And please, along the way, feel free to drop your questions in the Q&A, and we will address those at the close of Professor Montfort's talk. Thank you so much.
Now me. Thank you. Thanks everyone for being here. I'm going to share some slides and just talk at you for a bit. And then I hope we'll have a chance for more of an exchange. So I'll just go share screen. Okay, I have pictures of trees to help me relax. That's my backyard. The sort of subtitle for what I want to talk about is Find Your Students. Let's go. So I wanted to tell you about where I'm starting. This is a huge topic. Don't know you, you don't know me. So I thought this is what I consider the ground. Here's where I'm starting. First off, if you look at the demographics and like presented in the land acknowledgement, sort of ideals compared to the statistics here, I think engineering education as a system is not very diverse, equitable, or inclusive. And that's a complex problem for our society, partly because access to engineering as a career, engineering tools and mindsets is a valuable resource, and we want to distribute it equitably and democratically. I also think engineering and science are inherently political, social, and dynamic. We'll talk more about that, but the idea that all these things are mixed into our society and you can't remove people from anything that we do. Another important starting place for me is I have a pretty narrow and privileged experience. I didn't start thinking about the culture of engineering broadly and how it might affect students until I was a PhD student in a department, which means I had a pretty easy pathway. It was set up for folk like me, and it just assumed I was supposed to be there. So I'm hoping that today I'll bring things up that might make you wonder or think, and there's openings there for more different scholars to provide the rest of the picture. I'm hoping to get things started, and we'll see where it goes next. There's me. So generally, we're talking about pedagogy, and I wanted to situate it first. I know as individual instructors, my kids used to call them instruction workers, confusing construction and instruction. We don't necessarily have a bunch of control over every element of our class. So there's a structure to the class that we're given. Might have a lecture component, a lab, a recitation. How the time is structured is often out of our control. There's multiple layers of committees of people looking at what we do in the classroom and what's included and what's not, and these cycles of evaluation. I know that those are all really important. They vary site to site, and their impact varies instructor by instructor and course by course. So we're just going to treat the structural issues of universities as somewhat fixed for now, for this little talk. Then, in thinking about what is learning, what are students supposed to be doing, what's the goal of pedagogy, I think of it as it's an effortful process of change of mental patterns. So in order to understand it as instructors or people trying to guide learning, we have to think about both where people are starting, what they know when we meet them and how they think, and what we would like to change, where we want them to end up. If I have a very few references at the end, if this is interesting to you, I suggest a couple of books, and the words that I use to describe this sort of general approach to pedagogy is constructivist, is the assumption that you have to know where people are starting to make good progress. And then backwards design is a specific approach to how you design the classroom interactions. Those will be at the end. Okay, so a pretty picture to try and describe what I think the classroom is. So we can imagine a triangle. The pictures I've chosen are the Talking Heads, the band. Just by free word association, I wanted a talking head for the teacher, and then I thought that's not fair, so the students are also talking heads. So you can imagine 3 points of a triangle. I'm making all these gestures to the camera that you can't see. There's an instructor, that's us, I think, who I'm talking to is mostly instructors. There's the content of the course, of the program, and then there's students. And the class can be thought of a three-way interaction between those things. The instructor and the students are both oriented toward the content, and then they talk to each other about that content. You can look at the three sides, try and situate things we're more used to talking about. So the instructor interacting with the content, you have some control over the design and the structure of the course, what students are doing with their time, what you're focusing on. That's a complex interaction. All those things about ABET and program evaluation, all of those are left out of this diagram, but we know they're back there, working in that two-way arrow between the instructor and the content. Similarly, the students interact with the content, and that's where learning happens. Do I have another? Yeah, stars. That's what I'm really focused on for pedagogy. The students interacting with the content and putting effort into changing their ways of thinking and doing. And then there's instructor to student interactions. And in this very simplified view, I'm thinking about assignments basically and assessments. The students and the instructors check in with each other about the student understanding basically. This is somewhat based on an interesting philosophical approach that we could talk about more if people are interested in that. So I think what I'm supposed to be talking about is how we can make our teaching more inclusive and equitable. And my advice is that we need to, what I'm good at, I think, is talking about how we're supposed to think about things. So that's what I'm going to focus on and hopefully make it more practical. So I think we need to think about equity and inclusion in teaching as work that we need to do to go find the students. So to overcome barriers, to close distances between the content, ourselves, and the students. Students coming to university, there's so much going on. We could look at the cultures that we're trying to welcome them into. We want them to feel welcome in our departments, in our colleges, in the concept of engineering, in the academic culture. And there's also many institutions, all of them that I've ever been to, are very much centered on a specific cultural group, white Americans in the middle class, basically. The way we speak, what we assume is normal and professional, all of those are situated in our cultures. And a very specific group of cultures have informed how universities work. So I think the way we should think of it as we're hosts with an agenda. Those the asterisks note that there's more reading about that in the references if it's interesting to you. So looking at the big project of making pedagogy more inclusive and equitable, I think what you need to hear, my advice, assuming what you know and what you think, is that first we need to work on listening. That's not all that's required, but I think it's our first step. And at any point, more listening is probably good. So even if you already know all this, it can be a useful inspiration. So there's a couple types of listening. What I mean by that word, a couple of things. The picture on the right sort of shows what I think a typical classroom interaction might be. So we have the students on the right, they have an orange thought bubble, and over that, the instructor is speaking or making text, writing, speaking, choosing things for them to read with the intent of presenting a very clear, tight, organized presentation of the content. So that blue file folder thing is supposed to represent the structures and the laws and the organization that is available to us as experts in what we're instructing, and seems like the best way to understand this material. I think another way to think about the class is that students talk about their thinking and instructors respond. And the way that the instructors respond needs to both include the student thinking and the structured, organized content. So I think to become better listeners or to incorporate listening into pedagogy, there's a couple of tips here. I think there's 3 slides of tips. The first thing is to start with your researcher mind, your scholar mind, or your learner mind, and assume that open position with a little bit of skepticism that you take when you're researching something or learning something for yourself. So you want to build your explanations about what students are thinking or what they mean based on evidence, and you want to be really careful about checking what you think you know against what you can actually acquire some evidence for. And in the same way, you want to triangulate, verify, and confirm. So we can listen to students, but we need to keep listening and keep modulating what we think we understand from them. And I think most of people are familiar with that kind of mindset, but it may not be translated into the classroom all the time. I think the next most important thing is to include the students in the project. And I think we're all familiar with the multiple ways that students listen to us. They are very good at navigating the academic system, especially if they're in a big engineering program in a land-grant university. they've passed some filters to show that they can take instructions and fill out worksheets and meet academic standards in a lot of different ways. So they come to university and we might tell them, here's my philosophy, here's what I think is important. And they listen to that a little, but more they listen to the structure of the class and what they're rewarded for. And they see what we value by how we spend our time. So to get the listening working, you really need to make a space for it in the class and show students at every level, this is something that you think is important. Using time in class for listening is a big move. It shows students that you think it's worth some of that precious time, that progress is being made when that's happening. Overall, the best structure, I think, to include more listening in your pedagogy is to assign what they call group-worthy tasks. And there's a asterisk there. There's a website that defines it very precisely. It basically means you can't assign a group a simple linear calculation and expect them to interact a lot. But if you ask the right type of open-ended question that a single person can't process in the time given, that sets it up for students to interact with each other. It starts to fill the air with talking. It becomes more normal to talk, and that makes it easier for you to listen. Shared visible artifacts. In person, our colleague of mine, Milo Koretsky, you might know him. We had all this group work going for years, and at one point he had the idea, let's use little whiteboards that each group of students can use, give each student a different color of marker. And then when you walk around the room, if you see, you could just glance at the whiteboard and see a shared artifact of the students' interaction, which makes it a lot easier for you to engage at the right level or see when students are working together well. Another way you show students it's important, and everyone has their own relationship with grades compared to learning and how we're inspiring and motivating students. But one way to show students that something is worth their time and important is to give them points for it, make an assignment, show that you notice if they do it or don't do it, and that it matters. A way to think about that is with something like listening or group work or asking them to share their thinking. You want to support the effort. So give them points for the process rather than a product. We'll get more into that, why students might not share their thinking in a bit. So how to kind of move into this. And I'm not saying that every course needs to be 100% instructors listening to students. If this seems entirely new or different, trying to add one day of a listening activity to a course would be valuable. So the amount that you incorporate this into your class is up to you. I mean, it works in many different sizes and scales. So if it's not a part of your standard practice, now there's a bit of a startup process. I think it's really important to explain to the students what you're doing, why you want them to talk, what you think is going to happen when you launch. You say, okay, go work on this. You say, here's what I think you're going to do. And here's why I think that's worth your time. That's often an opportunity to model the type of speaking that you want to hear from the students. Our classes are our projects and we're always learning. So there's a good resource there to show students how a professional or instructor deals with sharing information they're not 100% confident about. So you say, oh, I'm trying this new listening thing. I think it's really important to help you interact with each other and develop your thinking. Here's what I hope happens. So you can open up the room, make it more normal for people to talk in that space without sounding like a lecture or a perfectly prepared speech. And then you want to scaffold up to it. You can make students speaking in class or to each other, you can make that normal by setting kind of small goals and building up to it. So some easy ones are if you're looking at something together, just ask someone to describe it and set the expectation that they say, well, I see a circle and a triangle. You're like, great, okay, let's build from there. Accepting their speak, making more of it happen. You can try to ask questions that you think everybody knows. So there's equal opportunity there. You know, what chapter are we on? What were we talking about last week? When's your homework due again? That's kind of frustrating to them, but something that you can expect everyone kind of knows helps open up the door. And then asking students to cover the same content again. So someone gives an answer, you can ask for another one. And that helps set the stage that this isn't necessarily, speaking in class isn't necessarily like a linear conversation where we have to build and build and build and build. We're focusing on an idea and we might circle around there for a little bit. That helps students feel more able and open to share when they're not thinking that whatever I say has to move the whole class forward, right? They're allowed to contribute their own piece without feeling like they have to carry the whole conversation. So asking students to repeat things or rephrase things can help make that space. So listening really is not enough unless you're also hearing and incorporating it. So you want to practice building on what you get from students. I have this suggestion, I can't remember where I put it. I worked as an intern in engineering training a little bit in undergrad with some civil engineers. And there's still my go-to mental model of what's a good engineer? What would an engineer do? I think of my friend Scott Wenger, and he has a particular habit of when someone finishes talking, he goes, mm-hmm, okay, and it drags out. And really, he's only allowing maybe 3 seconds at most of silence, but it makes a huge difference. And allowing the silence before he speaks sort of offsets the inherent power differential. If someone's thinking of him as the engineer, the professional, the big high mucky muck, they speak and he allows their words to hold a bunch of space. It builds trust, and it's not a natural way of speaking, but it shows that you care and that you're listening. So building in that silence gives you a little bit of time to think and process. You can also work on rephrasing what they've said back to them. So it sounds like you're saying this, is that what you mean? Or if I phrase it like that, is that what you're saying? You want to focus on what's correct or right in what they're saying, or what's a positive direction, and reinforce that. And then if you want to change their thinking, you want to try and build a line of questions that goes from what they've said, where they're starting, to what you want them to be thinking about. And again, all these can be really transparent too. We don't have to outmaneuver and manipulate the students. You can be listening, say, okay, I think you said this. Now I'm worried about these other things, and I'm trying to think how that connects to what you said. And they can share with you and collaborate then in that space. I think another way to show that you're listening is to have, as a designer, the structure and the setup of the class, listen to the students there too. Couple of important questions that I've been working on remembering to consider now is this more work really going to help them? I try to talk to the students. I have the luxury this term of having 16 students, and I'm used to 60 or more. So I have the chance to ask them, like, what do you think? What do you feel? And they unanimously don't think that more work will help them. They're overworked and busy. And no matter what I think I'm doing, they feel like you're adding more work to my life, and I already have too much. That's hard to hear. It's hard to listen to that because I think I'm helping them. But I need to show that I've heard it and I understand, and it's affecting how I interact with them. Another important thing as a designer to think is that students speak to different degrees, right? And some are much more willing to share concerns or issues than others. So you want to try and think of the students as a complex heterogeneous body and be trying to think, okay, I've heard this from students. How many does that really apply to? What's the mix there? A huge part, a great place to start listening is, so I started with that triangle of what I think the course is. Students come to our courses with very different models of what they think is going on and what their expectations are. Um, and you can come across as unintelligible if they have a set of expectations that you're not aware of. They might be interpreting your moves and speech in different ways. So it's helpful to know what you think happens here. What's our goal and why are we doing this? And then lastly, you, you're listening to them and watching them to see when is the right time to provide the information that you have. I feel like 2 50-minute lectures, so 100 minutes of lecture um, at my timing. So, okay, we're going to work on this. Let me tell you about it before we do that. Is less effective for almost all the students than if I give them 5 minutes after they've worked on it and they have questions. So setting that up, being aware of when they're ready to listen, when they want you to talk to them is an important listening task. So assuming this is a good idea and you've tried different things, it's hard. There's long silences. So if you're wondering why won't these students talk, or you have a huge class and you're asking for feedback and it's like pulling teeth. So a reminder here, be scholarly, use your research mind, be critical of your first assumptions. And think of the student's point of view. One way to look at it is they're doing sort of risk-benefit calculations. Something I learned early in my research on mechanics of materials as a student, I was always confused by the difference between normal and shear stress, a concept that is like day 3, I think, in that course, and I could never quite make sense of it in my mind, but I never asked. I had a year of structural engineering questions with 2 really great, open, friendly instructors. It was never worth it to me to ask. And because there was a perceived risk there, we covered it a long time ago. It seems like everyone else understands it. I don't want to put myself out there in that way. There's a bunch going on with the students that we don't know, we don't have access to. So if they're not speaking, it feels like they're not helping, they're not participating, but there could be a lot of other reasons going on. So what we can control is the benefit part of the calculation. We can make it more obvious and give more benefit to what we want them to do. And we can model that. We can show how we want them to speak. And then the first early on listening, a lot of it is just agreeing and support and confirming, yes, this is what we want. Keep going, keep talking. This is great. The reason I say we need to find our students is if we just go default or we stay with what feels normal, we're reinforcing the existing system, which we know from a lot of different research is not doing what we want it to do. It's not an inclusive funnel to help more people get access to engineering like we hope it would be. So that means we have to be intentionally working against some of the things that we perceive as normal. So there's a great deal of research on cognitive biases. And another example of that, many of you may have heard the number of studies that basically reveal in a group of people, if we're using our own sort of intuition and perceptions, we accept and expect the men to speak more than women. And if women speak even close to as much as men in a group setting, they're perceived as taking control or speaking too much. That's just a fact of how our brains work because of the cultural stew we've all been sitting in. So we need to add structure and be explicit about what we're doing to work against those assumptions. There's more about that later too. Okay, so just working as a scientist, as a scholar, and dealing with our students as little cognition reactors isn't enough. We have to be a little bit more nuanced in how we think about human minds. And I always say students are people. It seems condescending, but it's often forgotten in the conversations we're dealing with. So one way I like to talk about this is through the bridge crew metaphor. If you like Star Trek, there's a bridge crew. It's a group of people working in a control center. Stuff's coming in, they're making decisions, they're working together. It's a busy collaborative environment. You can imagine each person then is like a spaceship and they have a bridge crew. That movie, I think it's called Inside Out, just literally depicted that. If you don't necessarily like the metaphors or connect to those references, another way to think of it is every mind is embodied, it's incarnated. A brain is a combination of meat, acid, and radiation with very thick, strong connections to our guts, and none of it is perfectly understood in a deterministic way. So all of this is saying whatever comes in, it's in the same mix. So I say, here there be emotions. And once we get into this range, we're really listening to students and trying to connect. There's this sort of danger of an unknown realm out there. So I have a little interjection at this point. We've talked about pedagogical listening, and then I said something about empathetic listening and talking about emotions. So I've learned something, I think, about knowledge. I've learned something about epistemology that is really important to what we're talking about. There's a very common, almost ubiquitous divide in our minds, a separation between what we think of as social knowledge and what we think of as technical knowledge. Those might not be the perfect names for these two categories, but I think that what's the word? Identify with these two. So people think of social knowledge as flexible, kind of impractical, and common. So it's assumed to be subjective. So social knowledge might be: is this a good movie? Is this movie racist, or is this an action movie or a horror movie? There are things that you really can't decide who's right or wrong, and everyone has equal access to it. So we consider social knowledge to be common. If you're in a system, if you've gone to school your whole life, you can often speak as if you were an expert at school because you've been there. And that means when people do claim expertise about things that are considered social knowledge, it's not well accepted. It's considered posturing or proselytizing, or are you starting a cult? Or there's odd reactions when people are saying, oh, I'm an expert in this bit of knowledge that most people consider to be social or subjective. The contrast then is technical knowledge, which would be the home of engineering. I feel very comfortable here. It's assumed to be rigorous, meaning in our particular case, adhering to a scientific method, confirmable, objective, repeatable, true with a capital T. It's self-sufficient. We treat technical knowledge as enough to solve problems. If we teach students how to analyze a system, then we say, great, now they're ready to go design in this system or to go solve other types of problems. Technical knowledge is also considered prestigious. It's more important. Part of that is intentional from the history of engineering. One thing I think about here is how engineering in the university is positioned. It's got just enough academic, esoteric knowledge to be fancy and considered above the common person. But then also engineers are really quick to say, well, we also get our hands dirty. We touch wrenches and turn knobs. And so there's a particular claim about this technical knowledge that it's valuable and important, and working hard at it will get you more access to it. So this is I think, a problematic way to look at knowledge, even though it's perfectly natural for us. So the implications kind of are that some really important things are considered social, or we call them soft, and that interferes with the development of our expertise. It's hard to get better at something if you don't think that it's a learned skill. So some of the things that people categorize this way when we're talking about what students do and why they do it, whether our classes are fair, and how to deal with our own emotions. A lot of times people, if you're struggling with this, someone will say, well, you should just blah, blah, blah. Right now in the news, there's a bunch of people saying, well, you should just something about the vaccination, as if expertise in this problem is equally distributed, and a little bit of common sense will see to the heart of the matter. We've spent a lot of time with our students, and we have interacted with them in certain ways, but I don't think we necessarily have great access to their motivations and intentions. And there are people that have spent their research careers working on that, and they're experts in it. And from what I see across the field and the discipline, those people aren't listened to in the same way they would be if they claim to be experts in a technical field, something recognized as technical. On the other side, building the technical knowledge up into this prestigious position that you have to work hard to earn creates barriers for students. If they don't identify with the school, with the culture, with the buildings, with those people, if they don't feel like we are them, then building up our knowledge moves it away from them. It's sort of a Rapunzel situation. We put it up in the tower, and then we have to help get them back up there. So some examples of things that we consider technical that are, I think, problematic: banking. So there was a housing crash, and everyone seemed to agree, well, banking's very hard and technical. We can't judge those people's decisions. That happens a lot in public policy. Someone will, it's considered technical. Well, they must have more data than me. I'm not going to question that. A lot of people experience math this way. I have a middle schooler and a high schooler, and when it's time to do math, about half of the time we spend is them saying, I'm bad at math. And that to me is a sign that we've built math up into a certain type of knowledge that feels really far away from my kids. So the sort of representative phrase there is, oh, I don't know anything about that, which is a distancing move. And we're trying to get people to engage with the knowledge. So the point of this epistemological interjection, first, so we don't, as spaceships, as human beings, as embodied minds, we don't have separate systems for social and technical knowledge. It's all in the same brain, in the same body at the same time, which means to me that you can't make a course that only focuses on the technical. No matter what you try to do, human messiness, the social side, the difficult to understand and interpret side is there. And if you ignore it, that means that you can't treat people the same. They're coming from different places and having different experiences. And if you're completely unaware of that, you're just layering on more on the same set of inequities. And that, I think, means it's our job, if we want to teach them engineering, if we want them to be able to calculate the depth of a foundation, we need to make space in the course for the human messiness, for in big scale. So then good pedagogy for engineering helps students identify as engineers. Identify as engineers is a researchy language that, again, reinforces that social technical divide, because I think what we really mean is we want students to feel like engineers. We want their internal emotional identity processing to include the image of themselves as engineers. We know from research that is a huge step in developing their technical skills and academic success, self-authorship, satisfaction. A lot of good things come from that. Another sort of sub-implication there is when we divide engineering into technical and sort of social types of knowledge, and we focus on the technical, that presents engineering as if it was a knowledge base or a body of knowledge, as if you could write a book called Civil Engineering and someone could read it and then be a civil engineer. We know that's not true when it's said that way, but that's the implication of treating it as a purely technical, non-human subject. And that, again, prevents students from identifying with it very closely. So identity is engineering. Our work helping them become engineers has to do with identity and emotions. And then listening to students should count as teaching. I think when people come peer review our teaching, often we try to schedule it for a time where we're presenting or lecturing, as opposed to a time when the students are working and we're floating and facilitating. I think it's important to recognize that listening, accepting feedback, learning from the students should count as teaching. It's work. So I think we need to step up our game a little bit in terms of empathetic listening. The reason, the motivation here is back to that triangle where there's the instructor, the content, and the students. And what we want to do is be coaching the students on their interaction with the content. We know the reason they're here is that we want their thinking to change. We want them to learn. So a lot of what they're going to say, a lot of their interactions will be technically wrong. And the fear of being wrong, appearing unprepared or undeserving is a real threat for a lot of our students. And it's differentially affecting our students. So the students that come to us is largely controlled by the structures of education. And I hope we'll talk more about that. But just assuming we get the students we get at this point, and we are thinking about pedagogy, that we need to make it a place where students are willing to be wrong so that we can work with those ideas. If students don't feel safe, they hide the ideas that we need to work with, the assumptions, the beliefs, the confusions. So if you want to get technical, you have to make some space for working with emotions. I tell students, it's sort of it has to come first. If they want to get points back on an assignment, this is a good hook for students. I teach a writing class too, so there's lots of argument about whether or not they should lose points. So I say, that's great. I'm happy to talk about that. If you have an emotion, you should tell me about it, just to set the stage. And that little thing makes a huge difference. There's those frustrating interactions where a student comes in and they're angry, but they won't admit to it, kind of. So they say, well, I just have questions, the really forceful questions. I just think it's weird that you blah, blah, blah. So there's emotions there that they need to be acknowledged and dealt with before you can really make progress on this, the writing assignment. So a couple of tips about that. Again, you want to model it, be transparent about your teaching, and sprinkle in whatever vulnerability you're comfortable with. Revealing that you're not perfect and all-knowing helps make space for students. When you listen and when you respond, that's another chance to push the conversation forward. So you want to speak to their potential, meaning give them the benefit of the doubt, not focusing on whether and how they're wrong, but on the journey and the progress that they're making. And then again, like with the student coming in being angry, sometimes we get angry or afraid, or maybe there's a global pandemic and we've been in our houses for a little bit too long. We need to work with our own emotions. And the first step is a doozy, but it's just identifying them. Just being able to say to yourself, oh, I just reacted to that because I was afraid that this person was losing respect for me. Something like that. A little narrative that puts your emotions in the picture and gives them some context. Some more advice, I guess, on how to do this if you're not comfortable with it. You can use structures to help students overcome the sort of activation energy to sharing or sharing their thinking. So there's a bunch of activities. My sister is a K-12 teacher, and she's taught high school, middle school, and elementary school honors and special education. And I use a lot of her classroom techniques, even though it'll say like, this is for third graders. I use it with university students, sharing with them where I got it and all that. So one of those is save the last word for me. It's focused on texts, but you can do it around homework problems or anything. If you follow it like a recipe, it gives each person a time to speak that's clearly their time. Nothing is going to happen if they don't speak. And then it organizes their responses to that to be constructive. So there's a link to that at the end too. Think, pair, share. I haven't heard that phrase in a while, but I think most people in engineering education have heard it. The idea is you separate individual thinking time so people can get prepared and feel ready. Then you have a small group, maybe one other person in a pair, where you share the results of that individual thinking time, and then it goes out to the big group. This is really helpful for me and other introverts kind of ramp up to that moment where you maybe say something to the whole group. The other thing is giant sticky notes. I just put that to remind myself there's many structured activities you could use in class time that ask students to get up. And so a giant sticky note on the wall over there, or it could be a Google Doc in the digital world. So we want students to go over there and think about this thing. And then when you're going to think about a different thing, you walk to another giant sticky note. You can also use that as the shared artifact. If they're writing up on a note, it's sometimes easier to brainstorm and get ideas flowing. And then you can work with what they've written on there and organize it after the fact. The last recommendations here are to give power, to be intentional and to give power. That's partly what I mean by listening. I got that phrase from, oh, I shouldn't have started that sentence because I don't know how to pronounce her last name. Diana Lambrinidou. She, I heard her speak about the Flint water crisis, and she has a history of community engagement around lead in drinking water in different communities. And at the end of one of her talks, she said, if you're trying to empower somebody, you need to be able to identify where that power is coming from. You have to give them power. And I know that this is all kind of high concepts and woo-woo. So I'm thinking the way that you can do that is to be concrete and give specific control. You could think about the timing of things. You could let students help you form the rubrics, the format of certain assignments, the pace. Which you choose will be completely determined by your preferences and your context. But having a solid, the students are in control of how we determine these 12 points on this rubric or something. That is a move towards listening and a move towards including students and finding them. I think a natural response to that is a little fear at the loss of control. And I think that can be a good sign. I think following that little tingle, uh-oh, I'm less in control of what's happening here, could be a good sign. It means that you are moving yourself out of the center of the class and making more space for students so that they're more able to share, you're better able to listen and work with them about their thinking. And, oh, right. So I saw a couple of questions before. I thought I'd just real quickly try to link back to these. How do we connect with students on a deeper level when our backgrounds are different? My answer to that was the stuff about empathetic listening and being scholarly. I think. So treating your experience as a data set and the students, what they're sharing with you is another data set, and being aware of how they should interact. When a student talks about their experience, they're the expert, and it's your job to accept what they say. If they say the homework's too hard, a really natural common response is to, however subtly, try and convince them that they're wrong. Uh, you can get more work done and more learning happening by saying, okay, for this student, the homework was too hard. What are the solutions to this problem moving forward? So I think connecting with students on a deeper level, um, there's a lot of internal work to make sure that you are presenting authentically what you want. And then small interactions where you're welcoming them to the content will build that connection. How can professors, especially in engineering, reach past fears of not having enough expertise to teach DEI related matters? I think to this one, I want to do the academic move of saying, "Oh, that's the wrong question." I don't really mean that, but to me, I think if you're teaching fluid mechanics, there are already DEI related matters in there. You don't have to reach very far. You don't have to make up a new case study. You don't have to look at Flint, Michigan to say, okay, sometimes fluid mechanics relates to human beings. The knowledge that we have of fluid mechanics and the calculations and the models that we're teaching came from people. They were developed by people to help other people solve pretty basic human problems. Centering the context of that, showing how the technical is just a specific example of other human processes that students are familiar with will help. I also think that fear is a great source of vulnerability and sharing to build connection with students. It's an example of something that you're working through that intimidates you and you're worried about taking the wrong step. They are too. When they're talking about normal and shear stresses and bending beams, they feel a similar discomfort putting themselves out there. And they're talking to someone in their mind has a PhD in this and knows so much, they're almost unintelligible. How do you suggest we adapt these practices while teaching remotely? I don't have specifics. I think using breakout rooms, using the structures to allow smaller groups to interact, focusing on writing things down to make them transparent. So I have a bad tendency of just verbalizing things. Saying, okay, now students go work in these rooms and talk about these questions. When really, if I'd written it down, that would be better in every setting. But with the remote setting, it's more important, I think, to put it down on paper and be concrete. I'm going to stop there. Thank you for listening, assuming you did.
Thank you so much, Professor Montfort. We have some questions coming in. I really appreciate that you addressed the ones that had been sent with the registration for the webinar. That was great. And I'm gonna go to a student question first. And her question is there a way that students can promote an environment of listening?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I think, let's see, I'm going back and forth in my mind. So that I think of students as a community. It's kind of a body, like a microbial community, where what we observe happening is this big mix of all these individuals. And then sometimes I think of students as individuals too. I think that a lot of what I've said people should do, my advice, I think a lot of instructors agree that it would be a good thing to do. So as a student, kind of matching what I was saying the instructors should do, being a little bit transparent and vulnerable. So saying, I would like to explain how I think this works and hear what you say. Is that okay? It's hard for me to answer that because I think there's so many reasons a student might not be comfortable just laying out their whole mental process in front of the room or in front of a professor. But when you are and as you're able, I think sort of talking about what you're going to talk about ahead of time might help.
Thank you. We have a few more questions. So one attendee is asking if you could speak more about the save the last word for me idea and how it's implemented.
Yeah, there's a link at the end of the talk. Oh no, I actually forgot to put that link in there. But if you Google "save the last word for me," it'll show up. It's usually presented as a numbered list of steps that you do in class. So it comes from focusing on reading. So the idea would be you say you have 15 minutes for a group of 5, and you break it up. So each person gets 2 minutes to share something about the reading. And I think it's important to use timers and to kind of be a little bit of a stickler about the rules. When it's someone's turn, no one else talks. You pass around the turn, around the group, and then after that, there's a shorter period for each person to say what it made them think of. But the person who shared the original idea gets the last word. So you say, in a reading situation, say, well, I really like this paragraph, made me think about these things. Around the group, people say, oh yeah, I thought about this, I thought about that. And then you, the person who presented the idea, has a chance to respond or wrap up those other comments. So it's a structure to help build something that happens naturally sometimes, where people are sharing ideas and really listening and working off of each other's ideas. So it's a bit of a scaffolding to help a really useful exchange happen. Is that, I don't know if that's related to what you're asking.
It wasn't my original question. I was reading on behalf of someone else, but that the questioner just said thank you. So I think that did get to it. And I really do like that idea, because a lot of times when someone proposes an idea, they would love an opportunity to come back and revisit it after others have weighed in. So it also sounds fun.
Yeah.
There's another question. Do you have any suggestions for encouraging more faculty to adopt these practices? For instance, getting these practices valued in tenure, or having it be acceptable to have your teaching evaluation be done during a day where you are doing a less lecture-based lesson?
I don't think I have all-purpose. One thing that has really helped, oh, there's a couple of things in the chat that just popped up that have links to the Save the Last Word. So something that has really helped, the most effective pedagogical change practices I've seen is co-teaching. Really, there's like in that writing class I was mentioning, there's 5 faculty involved in making sure that all 200 students get timely feedback on their reports. And trying to coordinate that among us is one of the only times we've really had these conversations with people, like, what do you think we're doing in lab? Like, what's the purpose of that? Is it a waste of time if this happens, or is that a good thing? So collaborating on teaching creates a lot of opportunities for change, and it can start small. You say, oh, are you dealing with this in your course? Here's how I do it. Do you want to share this activity or assignment or rubric? Sharing and making it okay to adapt. Say, I want to do it this way, and someone else goes, it's not quite for me. If I do this, does that achieve the same goals? I think that's where I would start. I always want to talk about the goals when we're talking about classroom practices and we're arguing, should this be 15 points or 25 points? I always want to go back to, like, why are we doing this at all? And those conversations get frustrating after a couple of years, but it is a good place to build the collaborations that will lead to change.
And in those discussions with your teaching collaborators, do you then bring the students into that at some subsequent component?
This, yeah, well, that a lot of times collaborating with instructors, what I'm working on is sort of the fear on the part of the instructors of being fully visible to their students. So what I'm trying to set up situations where they're in an unstructured conversation with a small number of undergrads. And for some of our colleagues, it's been years since they've been in that situation. So I try to, I'm always trying to design classes to facilitate my own interaction with the students, a chance to really listen to someone, even if it's for a minute. And then asking my colleagues to do the same thing. So this is what we're going to do in this class meeting. So I'm hopeful that they're hearing from students at that time. And then when we're discussing what we should do, each of us is bringing our experience with the students to our conversations.
I want to encourage other attendees to, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A. Oh, and someone just did. I like how you mentioned to emphasize the benefits of speaking up so that students may feel encouraged to do so. Could you give some examples of how you would do that?
Yeah. Think for a minute. So a really great time for this is at the beginning of a problem. If you're working an example problem or you're asking them to go work on something, what do we do first is pretty difficult and risky. So making it common for, as you're launching an experience for the students, to ask them, what are some brainstorming, what are some guesses of what we might do first? So you're lowering the risk threshold. You're making the assumption, oh, we're going to hear a bunch of things. Maybe one of them will be right. Who knows? Opening it up to a difficult problem, acknowledging that it's difficult, and letting the complexity and the challenge, letting that sit for a bit, letting them not know things and reflect on that, rather than we have this emotional need. You go, oh man, I know the answer to this. I just want to give it to them. So as we're launching tasks and they're starting on bigger projects, having them share out what's the first part of your strategy, and then obviously you can lead into, okay, what's next? What do you do next? Some really common questions that work for me is if you're circulating, say, if they've had some time to start, you just, what are you working on? And expect a real answer and wait and ask follow-up questions until they explain. Once they get started unraveling their thinking, there's usually some momentum and you can keep going with that.
If you don't mind, I'll throw in a question of my own. I was very interested in this notion of social knowledge and technical knowledge really being very much linked to each other. And the assumption that a lot of people in technical fields make, which is that social issues are orthogonal to that technical content, and that for that reason, we really have no reason to address it in class. And so I guess I'm wondering, you mentioned fluid mechanics, which is a nice example for me because I do teach undergraduate fluid mechanics. And so what place does that DEI and social content have during that class? And I know that you've touched on this, and maybe I'm just trying to convince you to give me certainty on this question. But if there are any more thoughts that you have, I would be grateful.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of opportunities that are always there. One is when you're doing Bernoulli's and all the different situations and permutations, helping them. What you're trying to do is give them a language, really, to think about an issue, and framing it that way for them brings in the social. So saying, instead of saying talking about the kinetic potential and what do you call it, elevation? That's potential. Talking about the different kinds of energy and always talking about them as real things in the world that are objectively true and always there. as much as you're comfortable saying, we talk about it this way. Remember, when we're dealing with this problem, we do this bookkeeping with energy, which we define in these ways, and centering it on a shared practice rather than a revealed truth. So one of my colleagues, I observed her teaching a mass transfer course, and I don't have a chemical engineering background. It was a senior level course, and they're doing all the calculus and partial differential equations, and they use such esoteric terms I couldn't follow. But at the beginning of every class, she would say, okay, remember what we're doing. Here's the kind of problem that we would want to solve in a real social, open, kind of informal way. Say, okay, if you get to this position as a human being in an institution, you might want to use this math to solve that problem. The other thing that's always available is that when you're teaching, you're doing a social thing with other people, and looking at that triangle again and saying, here's the content. We talk about this a lot, but I'm also here. I'm a human being. Here's my connection to it. You're a human being. Here's your connection to it. So again, talking through a bit of your assumptions about the teaching and what your goals are, it can build a sort of specific and present connection to the material, and it's a shared task. Then you and the students are working together facing this material, which builds connections.
I really like that perspective. It almost sounds like writing a Lonely Planet guide for experiencing the class. And I can see how that would give a lot more context to students.
Yeah.
I don't want to dominate the question session. Are there any other questions, especially from students in the audience, but from anyone? Okay. Well, if I guess that we will wrap it up then. We've gone a little bit over, and thank you so much, Professor Montfort, for being willing to stay and have this discussion and present your work. This has been extremely valuable, and we're really grateful to hear from you.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
Thank you so much for attending, everyone. Stay tuned for the next talk in this seminar series, and have a wonderful day.